Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today, a two-time guest, is Shannon Huffman Polson. I'll tell you all about her. LinkedIn Live is that this show, Grace Under Pressure, focuses on what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff. You know, the caring, the commitment, the compassion that we show for others. And when you do it as a leader, as Shannon most definitely is throughout her long career, you do it to bring people together for common cause. So welcome, Shannon Polson. It's an honor to have you on the show.
John, it is always good to be with you.
Okay. I want to tell folks all about you. So Shannon Huffman Polson is the author of The Grit Factor, an incredible book, Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the most male-dominated organization in the world. Happens to be the U.S. Army. And she's the founder and energy force behind the Grit Institute, which is committed to ethical, whole leadership development. And she's all over the world doing these programs, and I'm just fortunate to speak to her. She, Shannon, was one of the first women to fly an Apache helicopter in the U.S. Army. This was many years ago. And she combines her passion with creativity. She's an MFA grad, in addition to an MBA from Duke. So she's got it all, folks. And she's a mom and a fantastic spouse, too. Anyway, she served for 10 years in our military, and she earned her MBA at Tuck. And anyway, then went to Microsoft and did a whole bunch of other things. And now she runs her own business, which is the Grit Institute. Shannon, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. So
thank you, John.
Great. It's been just over a year since you published the Grit Factor, which is a Harvard Business Press imprint, which is pretty prestigious, folks. And tell us what the why of the book, and then we'll broaden it out from there. So.
Yeah, sure. You know, I had a young leader reach out to me about a decade after I had left the military and ask if I would be her mentor as she began the same journey that I had taken those numbers of years before. And this was all through an online mentorship platform. And I immediately said yes, because of course that's an honor and an honor to be asked. And then I realized, gosh, it's been a while since I served in uniform. Surely my experiences integrating into this all-male field was somewhat unique. So how can I scale what I offer to this young leader? And if I do that work, then scale the people to whom that work is offered. And that really was the genesis of what became the Grit Factor, what ultimately continues to evolve into the Grit Institute and the learning journeys that are available there and continuing to develop. And it was a series of several years of interviewing leaders in the vanguards of their fields. They happened to be women, they happened to be military. Every single one of them faced what the Stanford law professor Deborah Rhodes called a Deborah crucible, the challenges of an incredibly demanding job, right? Often deployed, often in combat, as well as being in an environment where they were sometimes not welcome and sometimes openly opposed. And these interviewees included general officers across the services, aviators from World War II to the present, a combat rescue swimmer from the Coast Guard, a Navy submariner, one of the first women Army Rangers, and many, many more. And 201, they shared these stories and lessons learned so incredibly generously and candidly. And so then I did that work to synthesize those stories and lessons learned, do that background research as well into leadership, management, psychology, and then put that together into what ultimately became the Grit Factor.
Great. And there's a commonality between the Grit Institute and the Grit Factor, and that's a word, grit. So how do you define it, Shannon? Because we see it tossed around a lot, but how do you define it? So.
Yeah, you know, as I started to do this work, I was trying to figure out what are the common themes? What are the things that come out again and again? And I kept coming back to this idea, and it was something that I grew up with as a girl when my father would encourage me to do my best and to push through the challenges. And this was concept of grit. And of course, you and your listeners will understand that Angela Duckworth's definition is passion and perseverance towards a very long-term goal. She, of course, is one of my the many research sources. I have thought of it as this dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. And yet, I think it's really, really important to pull out the idea that grit is bigger than just that piece, right? It's not this discrete thing that we pull off the shelf for mile 23 of the marathon. It's really part of the content of our character. And it's not only about gutting through or pushing through, although there are times for that, but there is a grace element as well. And that's why I love this dialogue that you and I had for the last couple of years.
And I think there's a determinator, well, it's not the right word, a deterministic aspect to grit because it's purposeful, is it not?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And honestly, that's one of my favorite parts of the book. I mean, at the end of the day, the book breaks out into 3 sections. And that really is, it's now what I call the Grit Triad. And that is commit, learn, and launch. That's very much oriented to owning your past, deeply engaged in the present, and then looking towards the future with that groundedness and that engagement. And in that groundedness piece, and that's the place that we've got to return anytime we meet change and challenge, it's about owning our own story and connecting to core purpose or heart purpose. And that is absolutely the crux and the foundation of anything that allows us to push through those times of change and challenge in a meaningful and may I say graceful way.
Great. I like to say that in reading your book, and I know your work, that grit for women gives them an edge, not simply a competitive edge, but a more purposeful edge. And do you want to delve into that, Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, like every person is so individual, right? And there are generalities, of course. I have a really hard time doing too much with that other than to say that I do think that in many cases, women do face this double crucible, which requires an extra helping of grit and extra foundation, extra strength in that foundation, extra engagement and extra ability to look towards the future with this audacity, this authenticity, and this adaptability. And in part, it could be that I think that sometimes, and some women will tend to really do the hard work to make sure that their lives are purposefully focused because they're balancing those competing demands or those hopefully complementary demands in some cases of that career and of that family and of that engagement in community. And I have to say, I know wonderful men who do the same thing. So I think
that's great. And it's interesting because I love the edge of grit, and it's because that we think of women obviously are feminine, and so in business, once upon a time, women would voice their ideas, and they'd be kind of push her aside because that's a sweet thought from a sweet young thing. All that, I think the world has changed, but yes. When I see that so many women, and I know you profile them in your book with all these wonderful stories of women of success, is they got pushed aside one too many times. And then they came back with a vengeance, but with not for revenge, but for I'm going to make my mark and I'm going to make it work. That's grit. Would you not say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they refuse to be held back by letting somebody else define their story. And, for many of them and for most of us, it wasn't about, gosh, I'm determined to be the first or I'm going to darn well make this work. It was really more like, this is what I'm going to do and I'm going to do it well. I'm going to be exceptional at it. And I'm not going to let somebody else tell me that I can't do something that I know that I can contribute meaningfully with. And so that really, I think that extra sense of purpose was this sense of like, yeah, there wasn't, I just heard a quote the other day that if you're still trying to prove yourself, you're still in a cage, right? So there is an element of proving oneself, but there also is this determination to contribute in the way that you feel called to contribute. And every single person should have that opportunity, regardless of who they are, what their background is, and what it is that they do. So I think these leaders of the grit factor and the ones that I continue to talk to are those leaders who refuse to be held back and constrained by somebody else's narrative that in some way limits their ability to contribute.
Great. Now, interesting thing, the book has been out for over a year, and you've been teaching these principles in the Grit Institute. So what are you learning? Is there an aha for you, or has it been expected? What do you sense, Shannon?
Yeah, there's a couple things, and it's so interesting, John, because the Grit Factor came out in the midst of the pandemic, right? Not when any author wants to launch their book and their ideas. But I will say that in some other way, it has really resonated with people who, actually with companies and with organizations where they're like, oh gosh, we really do need this element of a whole person, whole leader ability to be resilient and to find that grit in the face of circumstances that are incredibly challenging. So I've been very, very grateful that it's had that resonance. The two pieces that I would say have been illuminating or interesting. The first is, and I talk to this in every interview because it's so important, and I don't talk about it in the book, so I'm grateful that you and I are talking about it here for your audience, which is that grit and resilience, they're critical skills to success. We know this now. They're perhaps the most important attributes of success. And yet, what I like to tell every client I work with, they are not a sustainable operating mode. So while you've got to develop them, think about them differently in the sense of that whole leader character development. You also cannot expect either yourself as a leader or your people to continuously operate this way. And you've got to be able to look at where you can put those boundaries on work, how you can allow people to allow themselves to rest. This is particularly important in this high tech, high engagement sort of a work environment that we have very rapidly evolved into. And so that aspect has come out as really important to bring up when we have these conversations and these dialogues about grit and resilience.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. One of our colleagues, Sharon Melnick, talks about the on-off switch. And you have to go into depth. So many of us, especially the achievers, and you know the mode, are on. Well, that's diminishing returns. So we need to learn to shut down. I think that's what you're referencing. Am I correct, Shannon?
Absolutely. And I would say there are a couple of elements to that. And one is the day-to-day, the boundaries and the parameters that you put on work and allow yourself for life day-to-day. And one of them is on a longer term sort of a scale where you're looking at like, I'm going to block off these 2 weeks and I'm not going to be online. I'm going to be with my family or be with friends or be outdoors or some combination of all of the above. And so you're looking at both those long-term opportunities as well as the daily and weekly routines that will keep you healthy and able to contribute your best work.
That's so important. And I think that so often, and I know you have observed this, but this is the good thing that you practice is that you set parameters. And so often, leaders say, well, I have to be here and stuff like that. And then they overextend themselves. And you cannot be your best unless you have your downtime. And your recharge time, however that's defined. But it's important, I think, you're doing it, that rest or that recharge, rejuvenation, it's not simply for you, but it's for the team. So that's a key concept to think.
Absolutely. And it's both because you're setting the example as a leader by doing that, right? You can talk about that and you can encourage people by virtue of the fact that you've done it yourself. But also you just simply cannot show up as your best self if you do not take care of yourself. And that is something all of us need reminding of.
And there's a shortcoming inherent in that, and leaders are giving out and putting forth. But sometimes there's that thought, and besides them, I have to do this. No one else can do it. And so don't we overemphasize our abilities? Have you encountered that, Shannon?
Absolutely. Or over rely on yourself when you really need to be delegating and developing your team members. And not only does that rob your team members of that development and that opportunity, but it also robs them of you being your best self to support them in that development. And so, that is such an important thing. I'm glad that you phrased it that way.
Great. Now, here's a topic that brings both of us together, and we've spoken about it several times. And it came to the fore. There was a New York Times headline on the sports page, or what the New York Times calls it sports page. I think it's sports page-ette, but whatever it's called, about U.S. women skiers. And they said they're competing with grit and grace. So, and I thought, as soon as I read that, I sent that to you and we had a discussion. So what's the link between grit and grace, do you think, Shannon?
I think there are times that they're linked and there's times that they're not linked. But in the best world, in the best scenario, they are linked. And certainly in times of sustained challenge and change, they really ought to be linked. And that I do love that idea of practicing grit with grace, which in many ways is what we just talked about, taking care of yourself in that process. So it's not just about muscling through at all costs. It's also knowing when a situation is the right thing to continue with and when it is not. And it is perhaps most importantly, it's really about that relationship that you have with the people that are around you in those times of challenge and change, how it is that you can lift each other up, look out for each other, reach out to each other. And so I think there's so many opportunities there for, and the word self-care is kind of getting a little maligned recently, but taking care of yourself and taking care of others. And in that relational aspect, growing together as a team or as a couple or as a family or as an organization, whatever it is, using that opportunity for challenge to grow.
I think you hit on a key point there. When we talked about, as you know, I define grace as some generosity, respect, and compassion when mobilized for positive good. And so it's what you just said as a team, being the generous kind. That grit is that our determination, our perseverance, but we can still do it with grace. We can be open-hearted. We can be compassionate to others and, hey, ourselves too. Would you agree, Shannon?
I mean, not only agree, I think it's absolutely essential. And when we look at that Grit Triad, that framework that the Grit Factor brings out in that commit, learn, and launch, in that learn phase, is that aspect of team, both being part of a team and having your team and understanding that there is not one person who does this alone. None of your team members can do it alone. They need your support and they need each other's support. And you can't do it alone either. And you're not supposed to. And so really looking at that as this beautiful opportunity, again, for that relational aspect. And when we invest in that relational aspect, invest in our people relationally with learning journeys, with other opportunities to say, hey, I believe in you. I want to help you contribute your very, very best, because that's purpose for people, right? That's purpose for all of us. That is such a beautiful opportunity.
And I'm guessing while you have a very successful business career, both for large companies, but when you talk about team, you did not fly your helicopter, an Apache helicopter, by yourself. You had a crew. And so you learned teamwork when it really mattered.
Well, and that's actually a really great example, because in the Apache, the Apache is an attack helicopter. So it's tandem seated configuration. There are only 2 pilots. There's no crew chiefs on board. They're just the 2 pilots. And one of the things that was such an important lesson that was learned in the process of being a lieutenant, being a captain, a platoon leader of 2 different platoons on 2 different continents, and then commanding a company on a 3rd continent, was that although there's only 2 of us in that aircraft, it takes a team to launch that aircraft. It takes a team to keep that aircraft in the sky. And every time we took off from the tarmac, I knew that we were putting our lives in the hands of the guys that turned the wrenches and checked the logbooks. Those guys that were in the crew chief shack that had the oily rags and were listening to Rage Against the Machine. And so you get to know those guys, and you get to know them, and you get to love them, because everyone has hopes and dreams and ambitions and desires that are unique to that person. And my job as a lieutenant, sure, it was certainly about flying. It was certainly about understanding the mission and leading missions, but it was also particularly important to understand the people. That was the most important piece, because when they could do their best work, the Apaches had higher maintenance rates. We were able to fly our missions more successfully. And so it really, at the end of the day, always comes down to taking care of the people.
And there's another aspect. I'm going to throw a curveball at you, but it's and that's the teaming, because you're a choral singer, are you not? And you have sung with large groups. So that's a team effort, I'm pretty sure. So.
Yeah, no, I actually think music is a beautiful example of what it means to be part of that group, because it's important to not be too loud and not be too soft, and make sure you're right on, because people are cueing off of you, as you know, with your musical background as well. No, it's an outstanding example of how a team works in perfect synchrony. And I think it actually is probably, with the specifics of musical requirements and performances, about the best example you can come up with.
Well, you have a deep love of music, so much so that you have inflicted it on your 2 children. One is a cellist, the other is a budding pianist. And they'll thank you for that, Mom. Trust me.
I hope so.
In your work, does music play a role how does it affect you? Is it an energizing force? What do you learn from music in your work, Shannon?
That's so interesting. I think you learned so much. And I think the most specific relationship that I would give, other than, of course, the walk-on music for a stage when I do a big keynote to a big audience. And I actually always do listen to music as I'm getting ready before I leave my hotel room to go down to the conference center or go down to the stage. I'm always listening to the Top Gun soundtrack, actually. So that is certainly an energizing aspect. But I would say, actually, more importantly, on the deep work, I think music is really important. And I wish I could remember the artist that recommended as one of the courses of action for being an artist and a writer was to listen to Bach. Because there is actually, and I will say, like with my kids, and we always listen to either Brandenburg concertos or Vivaldi's Four Seasons in the morning right now, because I'm just teaching them these different big pieces of music, right? And teaching them to recognize it. But also there is a rhythm, there's phrasing, right? There's phrasing, there are pauses, there's emphasis. There are things that you learn with music in addition to it being solace, in addition to it being energizing, in addition to it being stimulating. It teaches you a way to engage in a meaningful and effective way. I think that we should give it much more credit for.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And interesting that so many jazz musicians found inspiration in Bach, what they call the line, which I think is more or less the melody line, but then also it's the structure. And, Bach wrote, a fugue, there are rules to follow and stuff, but it never sounds rote. It that always sounds inspired and different. And so we can, and I think that's a job for some of us, and per se, this isn't just an ordinary, I can make this gig special for me and my team. I think there's a link there. Interpretation, what you bring to it, the value you bring to it.
Well, and actually, as you know, John, the other thing about music is you have to learn, and I'm trying to teach my kids this, you've got to learn the ground rules. You have to learn the rules first, and then you break the rules, right? And so, but first you have to understand the framework. You have to understand the structure. This is true with leadership. It's true with anything that it is that you're learning. You've got to learn how to do it according to the template. And then, only then, once you have that template, once you have been immersed in it and you've owned it, then you can make it your own. But you've got to do that first work before you're able to do that improvisation.
Without question. And that's where the jazz comes in. So many of them studied music, classical, what we call classical. And so they knew what they were doing when they go off on an inspired riff or do something, whether you were Charlie Parker or Miles Davis or Wynton Marsalis, they know exactly what rules they're breaking. So,
but that's a good reminder though, because you do hear these stories from corporate leaders and from others where young people who are, they're ambitious and they're excited and they have a lot of energy and they're like, no, I'm just going to do this my way. And there's some aspect to that is valuable. It is always holding things in tension, but you do have to, at the end of the day, if you're starting out, if you're taking over a new position, if you're making a transition, you've got to start with the framework, and then and only then do you improvise.
I heard a funny story. There was a very famous executive, Larry Bossidy, that very accomplished. And he said that when he had his first management position, he said, I'm just going to hire a bunch of young people and we're going to do whatever we want. And he goes, I soon discovered that wasn't really going to work. So we needed our structure, we needed our rules, and then we can innovate and things like that. So it's exactly what you're saying. Now, we are in this era, or what the media is calling the Great Resignation. So I have seen the word grit and quit. What does that mean to you? So I'm not sure what it means, but I've seen them, the two words paired together. So
yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of reactionary energy right now in various ways, and that is in large part due to all of these unknowns and this very unclear horizon that psychologically we're ill-equipped to be able to manage. And that is, I think, in part that relates to a reaction to grit of like, hey, am I just supposed to hang in there? I'm not just going to hang in there. That's not what this is about. And of course, that's not really what true grit is about either, right? True grit is really, the adaptability is that keystone at the end of the launch phase. So you have commit, learn, and launch, past, present, and future. That future movement must include adaptability. That doesn't mean just sticking with something at all costs. But I do like to tell people that I would recommend, and especially young people who are used to moving a little bit more frequently than those who are more established, but even those who are established, is that leave a place only if you have had a chance to learn something significant and contribute something significant. And then if it still feels like it's time to move, then you can start to move. But don't make that move too quickly before you've done those two things, unless, of course, there's something that is quite serious that you're responding to. But I think that is I think the reaction to, gosh, I shouldn't just have to hang in there, it is a fair one, but it's also a misapplication or a misunderstanding of what we mean when we talk about grit.
And the note for managers is that people who are having those thoughts are often your best performers.
Yeah.
So we're going to do something very, very novel. This is my advice. No one's ever said it. Have a conversation with them. So, you know,
I mean, John, I have a whole chapter, as you know, in the Grit Factor on active listening. And it is the reason it takes a whole chapter is because those of us who are so execution oriented and so used to figuring out the answer, we're really bad at it because we think we're going to do it ourselves. Again, going back to the importance of both taking care of yourself and delegating to your team and developing your team. You've got to ask them questions and then leave them that space to answer. And then you to really internalize that. And then you pause, right? It's ask, listen, pause. And the response comes quite a bit later than most of us are used to.
Absolutely. Now, there's something about grit. I'm going to throw this out to you because I know you are such a dedicated parent and involved mom and communitarian, building a library. I will say that, extraordinary. What has grit taught you about parenting, or what has parenting taught you about grit? So.
Well, there's no grit and quit in parenting. I will say that. You're signed up for the long haul. And that is, I think they're actually, and it's almost embarrassing how many connections there are with leadership and parenting, right? At the end of the day, it's about people. It's about taking care of people. It's about, in that case, taking care of these young people that are going to eventually grow up and become adults. And learning what it is that they need uniquely and individually, because every single person on your team at work and every single child is unique. And one of the things you learn if you have more than one child is that what worked for one does not work for the other one at all. And so I think there's actually quite a lot of parallels in that. Grit is like, yeah, I mean, I don't want to just grit through this time with my kids. I want to enjoy this time with my kids. I want us to have this a family that is a meaningful foundation in their life and is loving and is supportive and is encouraging and is challenging, all of those things. And we want the same thing in a work environment, right? I don't think work and family are the same, so I'm not making that exact equation, but I would say that there are those parallels and that it really is about understanding each person as their own unique person and giving them the tools that they need to be able to contribute their absolute best.
You know, and I'm glad you said that because we all are unique, but there are commonalities. But you know what you were describing, it takes work. It takes work to with your parents. As a parent, that's a commitment you made. But with your employees, it takes time and effort to understand them. It takes time and effort, as you just teach us, to listen to them. So,
yeah, the other piece that I actually really like that some people are willing to say, and I think actually as a woman leader, it's a little harder because I worry, as I think most of us do, about being categorized in a gender-specific camp. But what I do love is that there are some male leaders, and I'm going to jump in there with them to say that it's also about love, right? It's about loving somebody. It's about loving those people that you're working with or those people in your family, obviously differently. But that love means you're looking out for them and for their best interests. And that means really taking care of them in unique ways for them because you love them. And that's a beautiful way to show up at work and a beautiful way to show up at home. And it's not easy. It does take work. I mean, we're taking parenting classes, several times a year because we can't quite figure it out. And that's why we have learning journeys at the Grit Institute. That's why you coach, right? I mean, we all need help and we all need our teams. But it is ultimately, it comes down to love.
Well, it is so much love. And that noted softy, Vince Lombardi, used to give a keynote speech about love. And that was about gritty football players, but the commitment that the players had for one another, as well as with the coach. So love is inherent. Of course it is. John Wooden would have practiced the same thing. So anyway, now we're coming close to the end of our show. And I always ask our guests the story of grace. Is there something you wish to share with us, Shannon?
Gosh, there are so many. And I think that grace is around us if we're just willing to open our eyes and look for it. But John, I want to actually rope you back into this because I think one of the things that we've had the opportunity to do in the last couple of years, especially as we've been so much more digital than we've been used to being, and that's something that's going to continue. as I feel like there are groups that have started to look out for each other, and I think you've sort of looked out for me, and I appreciate that, and help to say, hey, how am I going to help this person on their journey? And I love that quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Since we're just one day past Martin Luther King Jr. Day, like, our life is measured by how it is that we help others. And I really do feel like that is grace. And John, you embody that, and how it is that you look out for other people. And we all can and should and have the opportunity to do that. And that is grace, and that is love. And that ultimately helps us all with that grit factor that we all need to succeed.
Well, I am honored, and thank you for those kind words. And so how can people, and we will put these in the notes, how can people find you, Shannon? So
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at shannonpolson.com or at thegritinstitute.com, and occasionally a couple other platforms, but those are the best.
Great. Shannon, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And with that, we are going to close out. So
thanks.